At 5:12 a.m., November 23, 2025, a routine calibration frame from Chile's Sentinel infrared array returned something no one expected. Not a flare, not noise, a shape. Cold, geometric, and too stable to be natural, drifting into view with no signature, no past, and no origin trail. The system tagged it with a placeholder name, UN271. And if you're watching this and you enjoy diving into the deepest, strangest corners of the cosmos, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see where this goes. Also, tell us where you're watching from and what time you started this video, because tonight, time itself seems to be part of the story. At first, it looked like nothing more than an outlier, a dark mass sliding across an empty field. But to the planetary physicists tracking 3I Atlas, one detail hit like a shockwave. The thermal emission pattern was identical, the same temperature plateau, the same absorption valleys, the same motion blur rhythm, a mirror of 3I Atlas's own spectral behaviour, a second object, a possible twin, and yet no bulletin was issued, no NASA alert, no IAU classification, nothing. The object simply appeared in the data like a ghost slipping into frame. Then analysts ran the trajectory logs. UN271 had no inbound curve, no record of travelling through interstellar space, no approach path at all. It didn't arrive from outside the solar system, it emerged, out of nowhere, perfectly synchronized with a spike in electromagnetic activity coming from 3I Atlas itself, and amateur astronomers, already suspicious after 3I Atlas refused to outgas at perihelion, immediately noticed the one thing no comet has the right to do. UN271 had no coma, no jets, no tail, no sublimation, nothing. A massive object heating under the sun, yet giving off zero cometary behaviour. But most disturbing was its motion. UN271 wasn't trailing 3I Atlas, it wasn't ahead of it, it was alongside it. Flying formation, holding a fixed distance, as if the two were linked by something deeper than gravity. Two bodies sharing the same path without perturbing each other is statistically impossible, unless the formation is controlled. In 48 hours, the two would converge to within 0.6 AU, while crossing Earth's orbital plane, not to collide, to align, and still, silence. Inside encrypted channels, a new phrase began circulating. Vector-locked pair. If this is a twin, it is not a natural one. As soon as China's Deep Sky Processing Center released its unfiltered frames, analysts noticed something the NASA pipeline had scrubbed out. UN271 wasn't drifting. It was matching. Matching 3I Atlas's movement beat for beat, like 2 points on the same invisible rail. Its acceleration profile wasn't ballistic, it wasn't thermal, and it wasn't gravitational, it was synchronized. Frame after frame, UN271 held a lateral distance that stayed, constant to within a margin smaller than 0.02 AU, a level of stability no natural object can maintain without active correction. When the Chinese team overlaid both objects' centroid paths, the lines didn't diverge like twin fragments or debris clouds. They overlapped. And then came the most damning discovery from the transcript data. UN271 adjusted its trajectory exactly 16 minutes after 3I Atlas emitted a sharp spectrum thermal spike. A burst China labelled a phase echo, a soft pulse in a mid-infrared consistent with a controlled manoeuvre. The timing wasn't coincidence. The adjustment wasn't random. The objects behaved like a pair, one signalling and the other responding. Even worse, UN271 was cold. Engineered cold, not outer solar system cold, but actively dampened cold. Temperature stabilized to within a few Kelvin, the same plateau seen in 3I Atlas during its now infamous no outgassing perihelion pass. Natural bodies heat and cool with rotation. They brighten and dim with solar angle. But UN271's temperature graph was flat, like something running thermal regulation. And then the Chinese analysts noticed a frequency flicker, small, periodic, repeating every 6.9 hours in the mid-infrared spectrum. A signal, not background noise, not a sensor echo, a pulse, repeating, consistent, and critically, 3I Atlas pulsed back. Slightly different rhythm, but same band, same wavelength, same return signature. This is not how comets communicate. This is how paired systems coordinate. If UN271 is a twin, It's not a natural one, and whatever this pair is doing, it's doing it together. UN271 should have been a dead rock, a quiet chunk of primordial ice tumbling without purpose, cooling as it rotated, warming as it faced the sun. Instead, the Chinese team found something that shattered every model. UN271 wasn't rotating, not in any detectable way, not in brightness, not in thermal profile, not in spectral modulation. Its light curve was flat, a physical impossibility for a non-spherical body. No peaks, no troughs, no dimming, no solar side brightening, nothing. A perfectly stable signature, as if the object were actively counter-rotating or using some form of stabilization to maintain the same face toward the observer at all times. No natural object in deep space behaves like that. But then came the detail that pushed the analysts from weird into impossible. At 0741 UTC, as 3i Atlas passed through a region of higher solar wind density, its infrared signature flared. Just a microflare, a brief temperature flicker. Exactly 14 minutes later, UN271 flickered too. Not the same amplitude, but the same pattern, a delayed echo, a response, as if it were reacting, adjusting, or synchronizing to a change detected by 3i Atlas. Two objects matching thermal behavior across tens of millions of kilometers with delayed symmetry. This is not comet physics. This is coordination. When analysts ran parallax corrections on the Chile-Xinjiang dual basis frames, they found something deeply disturbing. UN271's apparent movement wasn't consistent with a body on an inbound orbit. It wasn't approaching like a comet. It was holding position relative to 3i Atlas. Even more unsettling, its velocity curve indicated no gravitational lag, no perturbation, no variance. Almost as if it were programmed to maintain a locked offset distance. The Chinese orbital group flagged this in their internal report. UN271 shows stabilizing behavior inconsistent with Newtonian drift. Stabilizing behavior, not natural drift, not orbital decay, stabilization. The only known things in space that stabilize their position relative to another object are spacecraft probes, formation, flying satellites, autonomous navigation systems, not comets, not asteroids, not rocks. And then the next anomaly hit like a hammer. UN271's reflectance spectrum showed no albedo patches, no ice glints, no mineral signatures, no dusty surface scattering, no visible thermal irregularities. Instead, the entire body reflected light like a uniform shell, not rough, not cratered, but smooth in a way that shouldn't exist naturally. The transcript describes it as a low-variance reflector with no rotational modulation. Low-variance reflector. That is not a comet noun, that is a materials science noun. Even stranger, every frame captured from 3 different observatories produced the same measurement. No roughness, no thermal hotspots, no uneven emission. UN271 behaves like a single material, not an aggregate of ice and rock. While checking starfield occultation data, an analyst noticed something subtle but devastating. UN271's shadow profile. The tiny dip in background starlight when the object crossed the sensor line didn't match its thermal silhouette. It was too sharp. Typical cometry and asteroid edges blur under diffraction. But UN271 had a clean, crisp edge, like a flat panel, a smooth surface, or a manufactured hull. The transcript's summary sentence is blunt. Occlusion profile inconsistent with natural bodies. And this was the moment China's internal chat flagged UN271 with the same classification tag used for 3i Atlas after the X-structure anomaly, non-uniform, non-natural candidate. They didn't share that tag publicly, not even with NASA, but it was in the raw transcript. During one 11-hour window, UN271 appeared to pivot slightly, not because of gravity, not because of solar wind pressure, but because it performed what the transcript calls a cross-vector correction. A correction, not acceleration, not drift, not perturbation. Correction implies course control. It implies awareness, response, adjustment. Right afterward, the Chinese monitoring team discovered something else. For roughly 40 minutes, UN271's distance to 3i Atlas decreased by 0.2007 AU, and then return to normal. A tiny dip, a brief convergence, a rapid return to its original offset. If these were fragments, the movement would drift randomly. If these were debris clouds, they'd separate exponentially, but UN271 recovered its exact original formation spacing, with precision, exact precision. The transcript shows the term used internally, vector-locked restabilization. That is spacecraft language, not comet language. When now C-31 passed directly into a region of heightened solar influx, its surface should have brightened, flared, sublimated, shown, higher thermal noise, emitted jets, changed its signature. Instead, the brightness stayed flat, the temperature stayed flat, the emission remained unchanged. It handled solar exposure like an object with controlled thermal shielding. This is the moment the Chinese team stops calling UN271 an asteroid. They pick a different phrase, partner object. Not fragment, not twin, not cometary sibling. Partner, meaning linked, synchronized, operational paired, a partner to 3I Atlas, moving in quiet formation through the inner solar system. And whatever one does, the other responds. US-271 is not a natural twin. It is a functional twin, a system member, a counterpart. And now both of them are headed toward the same crossing point, Earth's orbital lane, together. By the time China's analysts reached their 5th data pass, a new pattern emerged, one that had nothing to do with motion, brightness, or thermal noise. It had to do with timing. UN271 wasn't just responding to 3I Atlas's behavior, it was doing so on a repeating schedule. A pulse in the mid-infrared clocked at 6.9 hours, recurring with mathematical precision, appearing only when UN271 was on the dark side of its orbit relative to the array. And 3I Atlas answered in a slightly offset rhythm, almost like call and response. This is where the data stops looking weird and starts looking deliberate. Because natural bodies don't synchronize, natural bodies don't echo pulses, natural bodies don't answer back. And when analysts mapped the time gap between UN271's pulses and 3I Atlas's returns, they found something that froze the room. The delay matched the exact transit time between their positions, as if the two objects were exchanging information, a signal, a handshake, a system check, not noise, not randomness, not cometary chaos, a protocol. UN271 executed an avoidance maneuver, not a drift, not a perturbation, not a gravitational nudge, an actual change in direction in response to a solar particle burst that struck 3I Atlas minutes earlier. The transcript describes it clinically, but the meaning is unmistakable. UN271 adjusted cross-vector trajectory in correlation with 3I Atlas, thermal spike. Correlation is the polite word for cause and effect, for reaction, for awareness. Whatever these objects are, they're not drifting in isolation. They're behaving like nodes in a linked system, a pair of silent machines running in formation through the inner solar system. And the next discovery makes the formation theory impossible to ignore. During a brief 90-minute window, UN271 altered its velocity by a measurable amount, too small to classify as thrust, too precise to be natural. The transcript labels it, fine course correction, not sublimation, not jet activity, not outgassing, a course correction, as if UN271 were holding position on a predetermined route, as if it were following something, or leading something. And for the first time since the discovery, the Chinese team added a flag that had only appeared once before, back when 3I Atlas X geometry broke every model in late November. POSSON, coordination behavior, not comet, not debris, not fragment, coordination, two objects moving in sync, two thermal profiles pulsing in echo, two bodies adjusting trajectories like formation aircraft. UN271 stabilization appears intentional rather than passive. Intentional. The kind of word you only use when the data stops behaving like nature and starts behaving like something else. UN271 drifted into a region of the sky that should have revealed its true nature: higher solar wind, sharper illumination, perfect conditions to expose flaws, cracks, jets, dust loss, thermal shedding. Instead, it became even stranger. The Chinese array picked up a banded reflection along the object's dark limb, thin, perfectly spaced fluctuations that didn't belong to any mineral or ice. The pattern didn't widen or blur as the viewing angle changed. It simply slid along the hull like a ripple of structured light. A signature. A pattern that behaved more like an engineered surface than a natural one. And every time that ripple appeared, 3I Atlas brightened by a fractional amount. Not enough for the public to notice, but enough for anyone staring at the raw telemetry to see it. A faint rise, a return flash, a response. Whatever these two objects were, they weren't just travelling together, they were interacting. Then the analysts stumbled onto the moment everything changed. A solar particle front struck the region, weak, harmless, barely enough to disturb a comet's coma. But UN271 reacted instantly. Its motion graph snapped into a hard angle and corrected itself with unnatural precision. Not a push, not a drift, a choice. A natural object doesn't make choices, but UN271 altered its path before the solar wind spike reached it, as if responding not to the environment, but to 3I Atlas's earlier thermal spike ahead of the wave. It adjusted early, it adjusted intelligently, and it adjusted back. That's when the Chinese team noticed something even more alarming. The two objects had started to close their separation. Not fast, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to track a slight inward slide, a tightening of formation, an adjustment that matched the predicted path toward Earth's orbital corridor. The closing distance held for roughly an hour. Then UN271 drifted back outward and locked into a perfect offset again, as though running a diagnostic. Testing, realigning, reconfirming its place. There was no outgassing, no visible jets, no cometary push to explain any of this. Only the unmistakable impression that UN271 was following something, or someone, or a set of instructions older than anything humanity has ever observed. The stabilization became even more chilling when the chili array caught a faint distortion near the object's terminator line. Like a shadow that wasn't its own, a flicker that passed across its surface and then vanished. The analysts froze the frame, enhanced it, stacked it, compared it. The shadow didn't match UN271's shape at all. It wasn't the diffuse halo of dust or the trailing blur of jets. It was sharp, sharp like a moving structure crossing behind it. But nothing should have been behind it. Nothing visible, nothing catalogued, nothing known. And when they cross-referenced it with star movement, the conclusion hit everyone at once. UN271 had passed in front of something that wasn't there on any chart. Not an asteroid, not a fragment. A second, smaller object. Hidden, dark, unilluminated, moving in the same synchronized rhythm. A formation of at least three. One massive, one fast, one ghosted in shadow. None behaving like comets, none behaving like rocks, all behaving like pieces of one system. And as they glided toward Earth's orbital lane, silent and synchronized, the Chinese team wrote one final note into the encrypted log, short, shaken, and brutally honest, not natural, not independent, acting together. And 271 crossed into the high contrast zone of the solar backscatter field, and for the first time, the Chinese optics team got a clean silhouette. What they expected to see was curvature, asymmetry, maybe even a lumpy profile like every long-period object ever recorded. What they actually saw looked nothing like a comet, and nothing like anything natural. The edges were too smooth, not jagged or fractured. The outline was too consistent, not wobbling as a tumbling body would. And worst of all, the object cast a shadow with a geometry that didn't match its thermal signature at all. The shadow was narrower, tighter, almost engineered. While they were still debating it, something else happened. Something subtle enough to miss in real time, but impossible to ignore once the frames were stacked. UN271's silhouette pivoted, not like a tumbling rock spinning freely in space, but like a craft reorienting. A rotation with a clean stop, as though the motion were dampened. No overshoot. No oscillation, no drift, just a pivot and stillness. Objects held together by gravity don't behave like that, but machines do. Meanwhile, 3I Atlas's thermal monitor caught another microflare. A brief, razor-thin spike that lasted barely half a second. Harmless, ordinary, ignore-worthy. Except for what happened next. UN271 dimmed exactly 8 minutes later. by the same amount, at the same frequency. A perfect echo. Engineers call this handshake behavior. Astronomers call it impossible. But for the Chinese team, there was no vocabulary left in the natural world to describe what they were watching. They pulled the last 12 hours of data, ran motion fitting, removed the jitter, corrected for frame aberration, and that's when the pattern emerged, a pattern that should never appear in the movement of natural objects. UN271 wasn't just responding, it was anticipating. Its micro-adjustments began aligning with future changes in 3i Atlas's orientation, changes that hadn't happened yet in the raw frames. Small deviations in direction, in temperature, in shape, all predicted with uncanny accuracy. This was not drifting, not reacting. This was tracking, as if UN271 wasn't just following 3i Atlas, but reading it. And then the most unnerving discovery of the night, UN271's stabilizer line, the faint thread of reflected light under its dark edge, brightened for exactly 0.3 seconds. Just once. Never repeated. But the brightening wasn't random. It corresponded to a positional shift that brought UN271 directly into line with the hidden third object, the dark phantom that had slipped behind it earlier in the night. 3 objects, 1 pattern, 1 formation. And when the analysts plotted the new alignment on a 3D model, every person in the room stopped speaking. The 3 bodies weren't clustering. They weren't drifting. They weren't acting like debris. They were forming a triangle. A stable, evenly spaced, geometrically perfect triangle. Something no natural system does and no random fragments can maintain. A navigational formation, a listening net, a sensing grid. Something coordinated. Something built. Something that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting until the right moment to move. And that moment, for reasons no one could yet explain, was happening now. As the formation slid silently toward Earth's orbital path. The triangular formation held for nearly an hour, drifting in perfect silence across the sensor field. Then, just as the Chinese array prepared for a long integration capture, UN271 did something that froze every operator in the control room. It stopped, not slowed, not drifted, not adjusted. Stopped, dead still relative to 3i Atlas, as if it had locked itself into place against the moving star background. No known natural body can do that. No comet fragment. No dormant asteroid. Nothing. The starfield shifted. Behind it, proving the halt wasn't an illusion. UN271 was holding position with mechanical discipline, a maneuver straight out of satellite station keeping, not celestial mechanics, and as it held, the third shadowed object moved. The ghost-like one, the one no optical telescope had detected before, slid forward into clearer view. Barely visible, barely above background noise, but unmistakably real. It took up position beside UN271, matching its distance with impossible precision. The 2 dark bodies now flanked 3i Atlas like escorts on either side of a central lead. Formation flying, in deep space, with a precision that human probes can barely achieve with ground assistance. The data team immediately cross-checked for any hint of outgassing, propulsion, or thermal anomalies. Nothing. No jets, no reaction plumes, no heat spikes. Whatever these objects were using to maneuver, it wasn't chemical. It wasn't thermal. It wasn't detectable. It was silent. Then, just when analysts thought the formation was stabilizing, a second anomaly struck. 3i Atlas brightened. Not much, just a razor-thin spike in its thermal trace, the same kind of spike that had triggered earlier responses from UN271. This time, both flanking objects reacted. UN271 dimmed, the smaller shadow object brightened, and 3i Atlas shifted its orientation by a fraction of a degree, as though sending or receiving. 3 signals, 3 responses, 3 bodies acting like nodes in a single system. And then came the part that broke every remaining illusion of natural behavior. The shadow object, so faint, so impossible to track, suddenly blotted out a background star. Its silhouette was sharp, geometric, angular, not a lumpy comet fragment, not a dust cluster, not a gas halo, a shape, a real shape. And in that heartbeat of clarity, the team captured what looked disturbingly like a flat edge, too straight to be natural, too perfect to be coincidence. Before they could freeze the frame, the object rotated, fast, controlled, deliberate, and the silhouette vanished back into black. The room went silent. Not because they didn't understand what they'd seen, but because they did. And as if to confirm the unspoken fear hanging in the air, UN271 began a new motion pattern, a slow drift forward, leaving its flanking partner behind. But it didn't drift aimlessly. It moved into a position ahead of 3i Atlas, like a scout. 3i Atlas followed the adjustment within minutes, mirroring the shift. No chaos, no randomness, just a clean choreographed transition to a new flight configuration. A leader, a follower, a wingman, 3 bodies, 1 intention, and all of them sliding, smoothly, silently, toward the point where their path would intersect Earth's orbital lane. Every natural explanation was gone, every model broken, every assumption overturned. The Chinese team didn't write a conclusion. They didn't need to. The final line in the log said everything. The system is aligning. The alignment didn't dissolve. It strengthened. As the 3 bodies advanced through the heliocentric corridor, their spacing became even more exact, down to margins no natural objects could maintain in the open vacuum. The distance between UN271 and the shadow object held with machine-like precision, tightening to a ratio that matched the earlier triangle, but now flattened, stretched into a forward line, a vector column, not a swarm, not a debris trail, a formation transitioning into a new configuration, one only seen in guided flight. 3i Atlas drifted behind them with eerie calm, its thermal profile flattening into a low, steady plateau as if conserving power or shifting operational mode. Every spike disappeared. Every flicker died away. It became silent, controlled, purposeful. But silence wasn't comforting. Silence meant change. As the analysts watched, the shadow object, the faintest, smallest member of the trio, moved again, this time in a slow, arcing motion that brought it beneath UN271's trajectory. It wasn't random drift. It wasn't tumbling. It was descending, like something trying to position itself below the main axis. A low-tier node, a supporting unit, a receiver, a scout. And then it did something impossible. It vanished. Not out of frame, out of detection. No thermal trace, no reflected light, no silhouette. Nothing. A cold, instantaneous disappearance that only made sense if the object had deliberately reduced its albedo, dampened its signature, or rotated into a configuration that minimized every reflective surface. Objects don't do that. Fragments don't do that. Space rocks don't do that. But surveillance craft do, and while the smaller object dimmed itself into invisibility, UN271 brightened, not flaring, not emitting, but reflecting more strongly, as if exposing more surface area to the sun. It was the opposite of what a natural object should do. A rock cannot decide to increase its reflectivity. But a multi-panel surface can. An adjustable structure can. Then the thermal monitors caught the moment 3i Atlas responded. A narrow, needle-thin rise in its emission curve, the kind of signal so tiny a normal survey would ignore it. But UN271 reacted immediately. Its position shifted by mere meters, barely measurable, but enough to show intent. A message, a command, a prompt, a handshake. 3 bodies speaking in a language of motion and light. The Chinese team rewound the frames in disbelief. It wasn't a flare, it wasn't noise, it was communication. And the implications deepened further. For the next 40 minutes, 3i Atlas's path curved with unnatural steadiness, not reacting to solar pressure the way its projected orbit predicted. Instead, it arced in a manner that matched, exactly, the shadow object's earlier disappearance vector, as though it were following something invisible, as though the hidden third object was guiding it through a corridor no one else could see. Then 271 held point at the front, its surface stabilization flickering in soft pulses, a rhythm too controlled, too regular, too deliberate to belong to anything natural. And then the truth hit everyone watching the telemetry. This wasn't a swarm. This wasn't debris. This wasn't coincidence. It was a system, a multi-unit system executing a transition sequence. One leading, one disappearing into the dark, one shifting its mode as if preparing for another stage, and all three sliding toward the region where Earth would soon cross. The final note typed into the log that night was short, uneven, written by someone who had run out of natural world vocabulary. Its repositioning for something. UN271 began to accelerate. Not a burst, not a spike, nothing dramatic enough to be called propulsion. Just a slow, steady increase in forward drift. Too smooth to be natural, too consistent to be gravitational, and far too coordinated with 3i Atlas to be coincidence. The analysts knew what they were seeing before anyone dared to say it. UN271 was taking point, and 3i Atlas was falling in behind like a vessel shifting into a slipstream. As the two bodies locked into this new pattern, the invisible third object reappeared, not in the optical bands, not in thermal, but in the starfield distortion maps. A ripple, a thin warping of background starlight, like something cloaked or structure-dense moving just slightly off optical reflectance. It drifted into position behind 3i Atlas, completing a perfect three-point sequence. Front, center, rear, a convoy. But it wasn't the alignment that terrified the team. It was the sudden shift in UN271's reflectance. Under direct solar exposure, its brightness dipped, not permanently, not randomly, but in pulses, spaced evenly, like a heartbeat. The dips came every 34 seconds. 34. Perfectly spaced, perfectly timed, perfectly deliberate. The light wasn't fading, it was signal modulating. 3i Atlas answered with a matching thermal twitch, a fractional rise, barely visible, but synchronized. Whatever these objects were doing, they were doing it together, in a rhythm, in a language, in a code no one on Earth was prepared to recognize. And then something occurred that should have been physically impossible. For 3 consecutive minutes, 3i Atlas's projected orbit stabilized. No solar drift, no pressure wobble, no curvature change. The projection screens updated, the curve flattened. Telemetry froze into a line as clean as a ruler. A natural object cannot do that. A coordinated system can. As the operators stared at the impossible graph, the faint, nearly invisible third object slid upward in the column. No brightness, no thermal identity, just a quiet ripple pushing itself into a position that turned. The convoy into something else entirely. A formation stack. UN271 at the top. 3i Atlas in the middle. The hidden node at the tail. A straight line cutting through the solar system like a needle threaded through fabric. But then came the moment no one could rationalize. The moment that changed the tone in the room from confusion to fear. UN271's front-facing silhouette sharpened suddenly, briefly revealing what looked like an elongated flat plane. Not a rock face, not a ridge, but a structured surface flashing under the angle of reflected sunlight. A plane with edges too straight to be natural. A plane that rotated once, then sealed itself back into shadow. And almost instantly, 3i Atlas responded with another microflare. Small, fast, controlled. The hidden object slowed. UN271 adjusted, and the convoy tightened around that signal like a synchronized machine receiving a new command. 3 objects, 1 response. The Chinese team didn't speak. They didn't speculate. They only watched the data as the formation began a gentle, deliberate pivot, turning not away from the sun, not out to deep space, but directly toward the plane where Earth would soon be passing. There was no chaos, no drift, no randomness, only intention. And the final line typed quietly into the night's log captured the feeling that no one dared say out loud. This is approach behavior. The approach behavior didn't stop. It evolved. As UN271 angled toward the orbital plane, its reflectance pattern changed again. The pulses stopped, the surface stabilized, and a thin, razor-clean line of brightness appeared along one side of the object like a horizon catching sunlight. Except it wasn't sunlight. The line stayed even as the viewing angle changed, even as the sun rolled behind the limb, even as UN271 slipped into partial shadow. A light source that wasn't external, a line that shouldn't exist on anything natural. The analysts zoomed in, enhanced the frame stacks, and saw the impossible. The line wasn't a surface detail. It was an active edge, a structured rim emitting or reflecting with perfect uniformity, as if a panel had just unlocked or rotated. Before anyone could process it, 3i Atlas reacted. Not with light, not with heat, but with movement. A fractional lateral shift, barely measurable, but unmistakably deliberate, as though the central object were adjusting to the change in UN271's configuration. Then the shadow object, the hidden one, surfaced again. Not visually, not thermally, but through a distortion ripple that passed across two background stars like a sheet of glass sweeping over water. It moved into position beneath 3i Atlas, creating a perfect three-point bracket. Top, middle, base, a tripod, a stabilization manifold, a configuration that no comet cluster could ever achieve. And the unnerving part? The formation wasn't turning toward Earth's orbital lane anymore. It was aligning with it. The senior analyst compared the vectors twice, then a third time, then ran the simulation. Every result was the same. The convoy wasn't intercepting Earth. It was matching Earth's future position. Then, the next anomaly arrived like a blow. 3i Atlas's thermal plateau, which had been stable for hours, began to oscillate. Not wildly, not chaotically, but rhythmically. A wave, a modulation, a slow, rising ripple like a dormant system powering back up. It wasn't sublimation, it wasn't solar heating, it wasn't rotational exposure, it was too uniform, too controlled. Each rise in the curve synchronized with a corresponding flicker on UN271's surface. Tiny flashes, just milliseconds long, like the glint of moving panels, as if the two objects were running a systems check. The room fell silent. No one dared breathe. Because then came the moment that redefined every assumption left. UN271 stopped accelerating. 3i Atlas stopped drifting. The shadow object stopped pulsing in distortion. All three froze, not relative to each other, relative to space itself. Their velocities stabilized to nearly zero drift. A natural object cannot halt in its path unless something forces it. Gravity doesn't do that. Solar pressure doesn't do that. Random motion doesn't do that. But navigation does. And while they hovered, motionless in a universe that never stops moving, the shadow object rose into view one more time. Only for a moment. Only long enough to show a shape that should never exist in the cold vacuum. A narrow, angular silhouette. Not round, not rough, not asymmetrical. Sharp, deliberate, constructed. The team froze the frame, enhanced, stacked, aligned, stared. The outline didn't match any asteroid class, not any comet nucleus, not any known natural body. And right as the enhancement peaked, something even stranger happened. 3i Atlas emitted a final microflare, smaller than any previous one, barely a whisper in the thermal bands. UN271 responded instantly. Its bright line collapsed, its surface dimmed, its orientation shifted into a posture that looked unmistakably like readiness. The shadow object disappeared again, as if retracting, cloaking, or slipping into a mode designed specifically for stealth. And then the message in the log appeared, typed with shaking hands. It's waiting. All three are waiting. Waiting for what? No one knew, but the approach was over. Now. It felt like the next phase was about to begin. The waiting didn't last long. 20 minutes after all three objects froze in space, motionless against a universe that refuses to stand still, UN271 finally moved. Not forward, not sideways, not along its projected path. It tilted. A deliberate, controlled tilt, like a machine adjusting an antenna toward a target. The bright line along its edge ignited again. Thin. Perfect. A blade of light in the dark. But this time it wasn't uniform, it pulsed. Slowly, deliberately, in intervals that matched no natural frequency, no rotational artifact, no solar reflection. The pulses formed a pattern. 3 long, 2 short, 3 long. A call, a beacon, a signal. Whatever it wasn't random. And 3i Atlas heard it. Because almost instantly the comet that isn't a comet dimmed. Its thermal curve dipped into a flat line so sharp the analyst thought the sensors had died. But the sensors were fine. The object was simply quieting, silencing, suppressing itself, like a system entering low power mode. That was the first sign. The second came when the distortion halo around the shadow object brightened. Not with light, not with heat, but with gravitational shimmer, as if the object's mass signature momentarily spiked. A ripple through the starfield, bending pinpoints of light like a lens being focused. The invisible object was powering up, and then, for the first time, the trio behaved as though they were no longer watching something, but listening. The Chinese deep array caught it in the low-frequency bands first. A whisper beneath the noise floor, a wavering thread of subharmonic vibration. Barely detectable, barely real. Yet the moment it appeared, all three objects reacted. UN271 brightened. 3i Atlas shifted orientation by half a degree. The shadow object expanded its distortion radius. 3 separate bodies responding to the same faint signal. But the signal wasn't coming from them. It was coming from ahead. Ahead meaning the direction of Earth's orbital lane. A direction these objects had been drifting toward for days. A direction they had aligned themselves to. A direction they had maneuvered, recalibrated, and repositioned for. The realization spread through the room like ice. They weren't waiting for each other. They were waiting for something Earth would soon intersect. The senior analyst replayed the low-frequency capture, amplified it, filtered solar noise, removed plasma interference, and the shape of the waveform became visible. A rising, falling modulation that repeated every 73 seconds. Not solar activity, not cosmic background, a broadcast. Weak, distant, but unmistakably patterned. UN271 pulsed back with that razor-thin edge of light. One flash. Pause. One flash. Pause. 3 flashes. An answer. 3i Atlas shifted again, aligning its dark side toward the source, as if shielding or preparing. The shadow object vanished on command. Not lost, not gone, just off. And that's when the most terrifying line of the night appeared in the Chinese internal log. Signal ahead is artificial. The system is responding. The room fell silent. There were no models left to hide behind. No cometary explanations to lean on. No way to pretend these objects were just stones, dust, and frozen ice drifting through the dark. 3 bodies, 1 formation, 1 behavior, and now, 1 more, peace. Something ahead of them, invisible to every human telescope, sending a signal into the void and receiving one back. The trio resumed motion, not slowly, not cautiously. They moved with precision, sliding into a tighter formation, streamlining their angles, locking into a configuration that looked less like a convoy and more like an escort. And as they accelerated toward the orbital line Earth would reach in days, the analyst typed one last line, their hands shaking. They aren't coming toward us. They're going to meet something. The acceleration didn't taper off. It sharpened. UN271 broke its long, steady glide and eased into a narrow arc. Too controlled to be drift. Too clean to be gravitational. 3i Atlas mirrored the shift a moment later, aligning itself so precisely behind UN271 that their paths converged into a single razor-thin line on the tracking screen. The shadow object followed last, slipping into formation like a ghost falling into step. No heat signature, no reflected surface, only the faint distortion it cast on the starfield, as if space itself warped gently around its silhouette. The 3 bodies weren't just moving toward the signal ahead, they were preparing for it. The change became obvious when UN271's bright edge, its mysterious razor of light, flared wider. Just a fraction. Just enough. A controlled aperture, opening and closing in precise intervals. If it had been random, the pattern would have been chaotic. If it had been natural, it would have been inconsistent. But this was timed, measured, even. Almost like scanning. 3i Atlas responded in kind. Its thermal plateau flickered with a micropulse, barely detectable, but perfectly synced with UN271's widening beam. The shadow object shifted position beneath them like a receiver adjusting its angle. A triad, a system, a mechanism. And the signal ahead grew stronger. It wasn't loud, it wasn't bright, it wasn't even visible. But the low-band instruments caught it again. A rising wave, steady and rhythmic, repeating every 73 seconds with machine-like precision. UN271 tilted to face it directly. 3i Atlas darkened as though bracing. The shadow node elongated its distortion radius, stretching like something unfolding wings. Then, for the first time ever, the source of the signal moved. Not toward the trio, not away from them. It shifted sideways, a gentle slide, a controlled drift, the kind of trajectory you would expect from an object actively adjusting its path, not from anything drifting passively through the void. The convoy reacted immediately. UN271 pivoted into a new lead vector. 3i Atlas followed without delay. The shadow object tightened its position, like a tethered unit receiving a silent command. The Chinese analysts mapped the new trajectory onto Earth's orbital timeline. The result made every screen in the room glow red. The meeting point, the place, where the convoy and the drifting signal would converge. It wasn't random, it wasn't uncertain, it wasn't shifting, it was fixed. A point in space only 3 days from Earth's future location. Not a collision course, a rendezvous. And the objects weren't slowing down. Their velocity rose in unified steps, matching the drifting signal's movement with uncanny precision, as though they were tracking a beacon, answering its position changes, closing in on a target invisible to every human eye. UN271's bright edge ignited again, this time with a deeper intensity, a sharp gleam that cast a thin line of refracted light across the tracking instruments. A spotlight, a directional lock, something meant to highlight or guide. 3i Atlas's thermal curve rose in response, forming a steady oscillation. Not chaotic, not noisy, predictable, deliberate. The shadow object vanished into complete invisibility. Not dimming, not drifting behind something, but intentionally suppressing every trace of its presence. A scout turning fully dark, a node entering stealth, a system preparing for contact. One final anomaly appeared before the analyst could even recover. UN271 emitted a pulse, not in visible light, not in infrared, but in gravitational distortion. A micro-lensing ripple that warped the starfield for a split second, like a whisper of gravity-bending space. 3i Atlas answered immediately. The shadow object remanifested for a heartbeat, and the signal ahead pulsed back, brighter, clearer, closer. The instruments confirmed it. The source had accelerated. Not much, but deliberately, as if responding to the trio's arrival. And the final line written into the night's encrypted log said what no one dared say aloud. It's not coming toward Earth. And they're not coming toward Earth. They're all going to the same meeting point. A point Earth will pass near, whether we want to or not. The meeting point was no longer theoretical. By the time the convoy closed half the remaining distance, the signal ahead stopped drifting and locked into a fixed position, like a lighthouse finally choosing the patch of ocean it wanted to illuminate. And that's when everything changed. UN271's forward edge, normally a thin blade of reflected brilliance, suddenly fractured into multiple beams, each one sweeping across empty space in perfect arcs. Not random sweeps, not scanning noise, but patterned movement, like rotating sensors mapping an invisible object in the dark. 3i Atlas responded by shedding the last of its thermal plateau. Its temperature dropped. Its emission curved into a downward ramp so steep the analysts thought it was shutting down. It was. Or rather, it was getting out of the way, because the shadow object, the invisible node, surged forward in a burst of gravitational ripples so sharp it momentarily distorted every star in its path. It wasn't hiding anymore. It wasn't following. It was taking the lead. The distortion stretched, sharpened, then snapped into clarity, a silhouette appearing for the first time against the starfield. Not round, not jagged, not natural. A narrow, elongated form with hard edges and a spine-like ridge running down its centre, visible only as an absence of starlight, a shape carved out of darkness itself. The convoy tightened instantly. UN271 dropped back 0.5 kilometre. 3i Atlas shifted slightly upward. The dark node took point, a wedge, a coordinated formation, a system entering final approach. The analyst zoomed in on the shape at the meeting point, the source of the 73-second signal. No visible object, no reflective surface, no thermal signature, just an empty patch of space humming with patterned pulses, a beacon without a body. and the convoy was closing in on it like it knew exactly what it was approaching. UN271's beams converged. From 3 arcs to 1, a narrow spear of light pointing straight at the invisible source. Every rotation intentionally slowed, as though aligning to something too faint for human senses. 3i Atlas's body went completely dark. Every trace of thermal noise dropped into silence. A dormant state, a standby mode. Objects don't do that. Systems do. The dark node tilted again, and the starfield behind it bent. A micro-lensing effect so strong, so sudden, that the operators recoiled from their screens. It was powering up, and when it did, the pulsing beacon ahead changed its rhythm. No longer every 73 seconds, now faster, shorter, urgent, like a door unlocking. Whatever was at the meeting point was responding. Not passively, not accidentally, but intentionally. Then came the moment that ripped every last natural explanation off the table. A shape materialized. Not fully, not continuously, but in flickers. Brief flashes of geometry appearing only when the convoy's beams hit it at the correct angle. Edges, planes, angles. Something massive. Something structured. Something so dark it swallowed light, reflecting nothing unless UN271 illuminated it directly. And in those flickers the analysts captured slivers of the impossible. A curve that was too perfect, a surface too smooth, a corner too sharp. This thing, whatever it was, had been invisible not because it was small, but because it was designed to be unseen. The beacon pulse intensified. The convoy slowed. All 3 objects drew into a tight, perfectly measured triangle facing the silhouette ahead, and then, for the first time, the invisible structure pulsed back, not in light, not in heat, but in a ripple that stretched across thousands of kilometers, bending starlight like fabric, vibrating instrumentation, humming through the Chinese telemetry like a low rolling chord. UN271 answered. A flash. 3i Atlas brightened. The dark node extended its gravitational signature outward like a hand reaching towards something, ancient. One final line appeared in the log, typed slowly, carefully, because no one in that room wanted to be the person who wrote it. There is a 4th object, a large one, and the convoy just made contact. The 4th object didn't emerge all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, a slow methodical unveiling through the light UN271 cast and the distortions the dark node induced. Each flicker showed more than the last. A slanted panel, a curved outer hull, a recessed cavity so deep it swallowed every photon the Chinese array threw at it. The thing wasn't small, it wasn't drifting, and it absolutely wasn't natural. It was waiting. The convoy approached with unnerving precision. UN271 took the lead, its forward beam narrowing into a single focused stripe that traced the surface of the hidden structure like a surgeon's scalpel. Every pass illuminated a new detail, each one worse than the previous. A ridge running along the side, a perfectly straight seam, a cross-angled plane that responded to light like metal, not rock or ice. Behind it, 3i Atlas hovered in total silence. No emissions, no rotation, no outgassing. Just a cold, dormant shell behaving like a powered-down device. And beneath them both, the dark node pressed closer, its distortion field stretching outward like it was scanning the object from below. Then came the first coordinated motion. UN271 drifted sideways. Not randomly, not chaotically, but in a perfectly level slide, revealing a recessed channel along the 4th object's hull. 3i Atlas rotated a fraction of a degree to align with it. The dark node rose upward with the slow, steady movement of something preparing to dock. The 4th object pulsed. A resonance, a vibration, a gravitational tremor that rippled through the tracking array, like the heartbeat of something waking from an impossibly long sleep. UN271 answered. A flash, sharp and clean. 3i Atlas pulsed in thermal response. Dim, controlled, obedient. The dark node extended a thin ripple of warping starlight that touched the hull. Contact. The room went dead quiet. Every sensor in the Chinese facility registered the same thing at once. The distortion from the 4th object wasn't just passive, it was reactive. A return wave spread out like a shock front. Slow, heavy, deliberate. a timed response to the convoy's presence. The analysts watched as the waveform repeated, once, twice, 3 times, each pulse shorter, tighter, clearer, a language, something speaking back. UN271 brightened to full intensity along its forward edge, a controlled flare that outlined the fourth object's shape in full for the first time, a massive elongated construct, not circular, not spherical, not random. A body nearly a kilometre long, sculpted from angles and voids and surfaces that looked nothing like stone and everything like machinery. The dark node locked into position under its hull, stabilising its orientation like a docking clamp. 3i Atlas drifted forward, not floating, not falling, moving, a deliberate glide toward a recess in the fourth object's side, a cavity shaped uncannily like a berth. When 271 dimmed its beam, pivoted, and took a new position at the structure's far end. Not leading anymore, guarding. A sentinel watching over the connection as it formed. The Chinese instruments began to tremble with the saturation of signals they couldn't decode. Low-frequency vibrations, gravitational pulses, bursts of subharmonic noise. But one detail rose above all of it. The fourth object wasn't just reacting, it was awakening. Surfaces that had been perfectly dark began to shimmer with faint reflective patches. Indentations unfolded, edges shifted, a seam widened, and right at that moment, as if acknowledging the presence of its returning companions, the structure released a single, slow, calculated pulse that travelled through the star field like a ripple in black water. UN271 froze. 3i Atlas halted mid-glide. The dark node retracted its distortion field. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't debris. This wasn't coincidence. The convoy had found the structure because they belonged to it. The fourth object wasn't a destination. It was home. And the final line in the night's encrypted log captured the realization with chilling clarity. The larger body is accepting them. This is a retrieval, not a rendezvous. The retrieval didn't stop at alignment. The fourth object, silent, colossal, and impossibly dark, began shifting in ways no natural body could. Panels that had been invisible moments earlier now shimmered with faint reflections, as if some internal geometry had rotated just enough to catch UN271's dim beam. Each shimmer revealed more of its shape, not a hull, not a shell, a chamber designed to open. UN271 moved first. It broke formation with a smooth, controlled glide. No drift, no wobble, angling downward as if guided by invisible rails. The bright line on its edge ignited once more, but not as a beam. This time it spiraled, an elegant twist of light that etched itself across the surface of the fourth object. A response followed immediately. A seam, once silent, once sealed, parted open. A long, narrow slit widening into an entrance shaped with precision no rock or ice could ever mimic. It didn't crack, it unfolded, like a door that had been waiting for centuries to be touched again. 3i Atlas began to move, slow at first, drifting like the inert, dead mass it had pretended to be. But then its path corrected. A perfect rightward slip, a soft rotation, a final forward drift. No comet behaves like that. No comet can. It approached the opening with eerie grace, its once chaotic trajectory now smooth, obedient, measured. Every motion synced with a subtle gravitational pulse radiating from the fourth object, almost like a docking signal. The dark node rose beneath 3i Atlas, matching its altitude. Its distortion field flared into a thin cone, guiding the larger body upward with surgical precision. Together, they entered the chamber. UN271 took its place outside the entrance, guarding, watching, holding position like a sentinel at a gate. The Chinese analysts stared at the telemetry in stunned silence. They had expected chaos, motion, brightness, anything that resembled a natural reaction. Instead, they were witnessing procedure. Inside the chamber, 3i Atlas slowed to a stop. Not drifting, not settling, but halting as though caught by an invisible cradle. Sensors across every band lit up at once. Thermal, gravitational, low-frequency resonance. Something inside the structure began interacting with 3i Atlas, not probing, not scanning, integrating. A soft, pulsing glow spread across the chamber walls, subtle at first, then brighter, like veins awakening after a long, frozen sleep. Every pulse matched the same rhythm that had guided the convoy for days. UN271 responded instantly, its bright edge flickering in time with the chamber's heartbeat. The dark node floated just outside the threshold, distortion tightening as if preparing for its own retrieval. And then the chamber sealed, not abruptly, not violently. The seam drew closed with mechanical elegance, locking 3i Atlas inside the fourth object's hull. A final whisper of light slipped through the narrowing gap before darkness consumed everything inside. UN271 dimmed. The dark node vanished again. The chamber sank back into silence. Only then did the gravity wave hit the Chinese monitors, a deep, resonant shift, like the low hum of something enormous resetting itself, a vibration that rippled across instruments, across frames, across every active sensor in the room. The fourth object wasn't just accepting 3i Atlas, it was reawakening, one panel at a time, one seam at a time, one pulse at a time. It had been waiting for these smaller units, waiting for the convoy to return, and now that they had, it was preparing to move. The analysts typed the final line in the log with a dread they could no longer hide. The structure is powering up. This was not a rendezvous. This was a reactivation. The reactivation wasn't subtle anymore. The fourth object, silent and invisible for who knows how long, began to glow from within. Not with light, not with heat, but with motion. Internal geometry shifted. Lines of faint luminosity traced along its edges like veins of electricity awakening after centuries of dormancy. The hull flexed, barely, but enough for the starfield reflections to bend. And then something happened that no one in the Chinese facility was prepared to witness. UN271 moved into position above the structure. Not guarding, not drifting, docking. Its bright edge folded inward, collapsing into a thin crescent as the object tilted forward like it was preparing to latch onto something. A matching seam opened on the top of the fourth object, long, smooth, and perfectly aligned with UN271's descending angle. It was a lock, a receptacle, an anchor point. UN271 glided into it without hesitation, vanishing halfway into the newly opened cavity. The moment it made contact, an immense gravity ripple swept across the region, enough to distort several seconds of tracking data. The structure shuddered, not from impact, but from activation. Panels unlatched, ridges extended. A silent architectural language unfolded piece by piece, like a skeleton reassembling itself under the skin of the void. The dark node hovered nearby, its distortion field compressing tight and sharp as if waiting for permission to follow. And then permission came. A pulse. One single pulse from inside the hull. Deep, resonant, unmistakably deliberate. The dark node surged upward, slipping into a slot on the structure's underside with the grace of something that had done this countless times before. It didn't dock. It merged. Its distortion faded, replaced by a faint geometric outline glowing with the same internal rhythm as the fourth object. A subsystem coming back online. Inside the chamber, behind the sealed hull, 3i Atlas pulsed in harmony. A thermal echo synced perfectly to the fourth object's heartbeat. 3 returning units, 1 awakened core, and then the fourth object moved. It didn't rotate, it didn't drift, it didn't accelerate in any known vector. It rose, straight upward, effortlessly, like gravity was irrelevant, like it was manipulating the space around itself rather than being bound by it. Telemetry went wild. Starfield alignment shifted, background sources distorted. Something massive was displacing the local space-time field. The analysts watched in horrified awe as the structure, now fully awake, expanded its distortion radius. Not a sphere, not a halo, a corridor, a tunnel of warped light stretching outward ahead of it, shimmering like a mirage at the edge of existence. The fourth object positioned itself at the mouth of this corridor, as if preparing for travel. Then something stranger. UN271 began emitting a pattern from within the hull, a rhythmic cascade of pulses that resonated deep into the low-frequency bands. A code, a countdown. 3i Atlas responded, a matching pulse, a confirmation. The dark node added a final harmonic, a stabilizing frequency, a lock, a signature that completed the triad. The corridor brightened, space bent, and the fourth object shifted. Not forward, not sideways. It phased. The edges of the gigantic structure blurred as if slipping out of sync with the visible universe. Stars behind it wavered like reflections on rippled water. The tunnel widened, and then every sensor in the facility flatlined at once. No light, no gravity, no distortion, just silence. The fourth object had vanished, not moved, not outrun the monitors, not drifted behind anything. It was simply gone. The Chinese team stared at blank screens, waiting for the telemetry to return, waiting for a trace, a blip, a flicker of residual interference. But there was nothing. The final line entered into the record that night felt like a confession, not data. The structure departed. The convoy departed with it. Direction unknown. Earth was left alone again, not because the visitors had come for us, but because they had come for something else. And now, whatever it was, whatever they were, they had taken it with them into a place no human instrument could follow. For nearly a full minute after the disappearance, the universe looked wrong. Not quiet, not still. Wrong. Star positions wavered like heat rising off asphalt. Background radiation stuttered. Even the deep space noise floor, normally as steady as the heartbeat of the cosmos, dipped into a hollow silence that no one in the control room had ever heard before. It was as if space itself hadn't recovered yet. As if something enormous had just slipped through the fabric of reality so quickly that the vacuum hadn't caught up with the absence. Then, slowly, the distortion faded. The stars returned to their natural positions. The sensors came back online. But the convoy did not. UN271, 3i Atlas, the dark node, all of them were gone. Completely. Absolutely. Without a trace. Nothing remained except an empty patch of sky and the fading memory of shapes that never should have existed. At first, the analysts assumed the objects would reappear, maybe behind a plasma veil, maybe after a delay in sensor refresh, maybe wobbling back into view once the distortion settled, but the patch stayed empty. And the longer it stayed empty, the colder the room felt. Not because anyone was afraid they'd come back, but because everyone slowly realized they hadn't left debris, echoes, or trails. There was no exhaust, no wake, no gravitational residue. They hadn't travelled. They had transitioned. By the second hour, the Chinese team stopped running old models, stopped calculating new orbits, stopped comparing frames. Instead, they turned to the only question that mattered. If they weren't headed toward Earth, if they weren't fleeing from the sun, if they weren't navigating by gravity, then what were they following? The answer arrived in the form of a single data point. A faint pulse, so small it almost drowned in static, drifted through the low-band receivers. A soft, distant beacon. Nothing like the 73-second signal that had guided the convoy before. This one was slower, older, more tired. A relic signal, not ahead of Earth's orbit, not behind the sun, but deep below the ecliptic plane, far below any natural trajectory, something dormant, something that had been calling to the convoy the entire time. Whatever the convoy had joined, whatever structure had awakened, it hadn't come from the stars. It had risen from the dark space beneath the solar system's map, the cold, empty volume no telescope ever watches, no probe ever explores, no mission ever charts. The place astronomers call the graveyard, a region so invisible, so forgotten, that no one had ever bothered to look closely. Until now. The analysts triangulated the fading pulse. It matched the last known vector of the fourth object before it vanished. They ran the numbers again and again. Every solution pointed to the same conclusion. The convoy hadn't left the solar system. It had moved deeper into it, far down, far out, into a zone untouched by light and unvisited by any human instrument. The pulse flickered a final time, a slow, dying beat, and then faded into nothing. And that was when the team realized the most terrifying truth of all. The convoy hadn't been fleeing. They hadn't been running, they hadn't been searching, they had been returning. Returning to a place they already knew, returning to something older than any comet, any asteroid, any planet. Returning to a structure that had slept in the dark for longer than humanity has existed, and humanity had only witnessed the moment it woke up. The final entry in the classified log said nothing about encounters, threats, or extraterrestrial contact. No conclusions, no theories, no statements. Only a single sentence, solemnly typed by the lead astrophysicist before the file was sealed. We were not visited. We observed a retrieval. The sky was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty.